My name is Clara Thorne. For most of my life, that name felt like a borrowed coat, something quiet and unassuming to wrap myself in while the world moved on around me. I was raised in the damp, green quiet of the Pacific Northwest, a child who preferred the company of books and the patient silence of the forest to the clamor of a family that never quite knew what to do with me. My parents were academics, brilliant and busy, and my older brother was a whirlwind of athletic achievement and social charm. I was the space between their sentences, the pause in their conversations. The only person who ever seemed to see me, truly see me, was my grandfather. He smelled of cedarwood and machine oil, and his hands, though calloused from a lifetime of work, were always gentle. He built his company, Viridian Analytics, not with bluster and bravado, but with the patient precision of a watchmaker. It was a boutique software firm that tracked ecological data, a venture born from his love for the wild, untamed corners of the world. He taught me to listen not just to words, but to the spaces between them, to the subtle shifts in a person's posture, to the things they chose not to say. The loudest truths, he'd tell me, stirring honey into his tea, are always whispered. When he passed away 2 years ago, the silence he left behind was immense. My family, who had long since written him off as an eccentric old man clinging to a hobby business, assumed his company had folded. They didn't attend the reading of the will. They didn't know he'd spent the last decade quietly transforming Viridian into a silent powerhouse, and they certainly didn't know that he had left all of it, every share, every patent, every line of code, to me. It sat in a trust, dormant and waiting under a single, unwavering condition he'd made me promise on his deathbed. Don't show them your strength, Clara, until you're certain they won't try to use it against you. I had kept that promise. I had remained the quiet, unassuming girl they'd always known. I had fallen in love, or what I believed was love, with a man named Julian Croft, whose family was as old and established as the moss on the city's oak trees. And so, here I am, the morning after my wedding. The air in the master suite of the Croft estate is cool and smells of rain-soaked earth and the faint, sweet perfume of the gardenias from my bouquet. Julian's arm is draped over my waist, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm against my back. He is peaceful, beautiful in the pale morning light filtering through the tall, mullioned windows. But I am awake. I have been for hours, staring into the gentle gray of the dawn, the weight of my grandfather's words a silent counterpoint to the new gold band on my finger. In my suitcase, tucked into a hidden lining, is a leather-bound folio. Inside, the documents that prove I am not just Clara Thorne, or even the new Mrs. Croft. I am the sole heir to a legacy they cannot even fathom. And as I lie there, a knot of unease tightens in my chest, a premonition that the silence I've so carefully cultivated is about to be tested. I slipped from the bed, careful not to wake Julian, and padded to the enormous en-suite bathroom. The marble was cold beneath my feet. I leaned against the counter, took a deep, shuddering breath, and looked at my reflection. My face was the same, but the eyes staring back felt older, warier. This was supposed to be the beginning of everything, the first day of a shared life. I had imagined waking up to coffee and quiet conversation, a walk through the estate's manicured gardens, the simple, joyful start to our forever. After showering and dressing in a simple cream-colored sweater and slacks, I descended the grand, curving staircase. The house was awake but subdued, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and old money. A housekeeper I didn't recognize met me at the bottom of the stairs. "Mrs. Croft," she said, her voice a polite monotone. "Beatrice is waiting for you in the sunroom." She called me Mrs. Croft, but the name felt like a costume, ill-fitting and strange. I followed her down a long hall lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors and mahogany tables bearing silver heirlooms. The sunroom was a conservatory of glass and white wicker overlooking a rose garden still glistening with morning dew. Beatrice, my new mother-in-law, was seated at a small table, a porcelain teacup in her hand. Her posture was impeccable, her silver hair styled in a flawless chignon. Her pearls glowed softly against the silk of her blouse. Beside her, a man in a dark, severe suit stood as still as a statue, a slim briefcase at his feet. On the table, nestled between the cream and sugar, was a pen. The cap was already off. "Clara, darling, good morning," Beatrice said, her smile as bright and brittle as spun glass. "I do hope you slept well. I thought we could take care of a little family formality before the day gets away from us." The man in the suit stepped forward and placed a folder on the table. He opened it to the last page, revealing a signature line. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. It was a deep, internal cold, the kind that comes with sudden, stark clarity. "A formality?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. "Just to align our family assets," she said, her tone breezy, as if discussing the weather. "It makes everything so much cleaner for estate planning, you understand. Our lawyers say it's standard practice for a family like ours." I sat down, my movements slow and deliberate. I picked up the document. The title read, "Marital Asset Consolidation and Spousal Power of Attorney Agreement." The legal jargon was dense, but the intent was clear as glass. It would grant them, Beatrice and Julian, sweeping control over any and all assets I brought into the marriage. My gaze drifted to the pen, its nib poised and waiting. They hadn't just planned this. They had orchestrated it, timed for the moment they assumed I would be at my most vulnerable, swept up in the romantic haze of a wedding. They saw a quiet, gentle girl from a modest background, a girl who had married up, a girl who would be grateful, compliant, and easily managed. I looked up from the page and gave Beatrice a small, placid smile. "This looks very thorough," I said, my voice even. "Thank you for being so organized. Of course, as a formality myself, I'll need to have my own counsel review it before I sign anything." Beatrice's smile didn't falter, but her eyes, for the briefest of moments, hardened. It was a flicker, a momentary tightening at the corners, so subtle that if I hadn't spent a lifetime reading silences, I would have missed it entirely. The man in the suit shifted his weight, a barely perceptible motion of impatience. "Of course, darling," she said, her voice dripping with honeyed condescension. "Take all the time you need. It's just a family matter, after all. No rush." I closed the folder and pushed it gently back toward the center of the table. "Thank you," I said again, rising from my chair. I had been the overlooked daughter, the quiet observer, the one who absorbed the world without demanding a place in it. But my grandfather had taught me that silence wasn't weakness. It was a vantage point. And from where I was standing, the cracks in their perfect facade were beginning to show. I walked out of the sunroom, leaving the uncapped pen behind, feeling not like a bride, but like a player in a game whose rules had just been silently and ruthlessly revealed. The days that followed were a masterclass in subtle coercion. The air in the grand house grew heavy with unspoken expectations. The promised honeymoon brunch was postponed indefinitely, with Beatrice explaining that she wanted me to rest and acclimate, without the pressure of hosting. The generous pile of wedding gifts that had sat in the foyer vanished overnight. When I asked Julian about them, he waved a dismissive hand. "Mom's having the West Wing redecorated. She probably moved them for safekeeping." Every explanation was plausible, every smile was in place, but I felt the walls of my new life closing in, gently but inexorably pushing me to the periphery. I found myself retreating into memories of my grandfather. I remembered an afternoon in his workshop, the air thick with the scent of sawdust. He was sanding a piece of reclaimed redwood, his movements patient and rhythmic. He paused, looked at me over the rim of his glasses, and said, "Some people, Clara, are builders. Others are just collectors. The collectors don't care what something is, they only care that it's theirs." I hadn't understood then, but I was beginning to now. The Crofts weren't interested in building a life with me, they were interested in acquiring me. A week into our marriage, Beatrice summoned me to the driveway with the theatrical flair of a game show host. Parked by the fountain was a gleaming, midnight blue electric sedan, a ridiculous red bow stretched across its hood. "A little wedding surprise," she announced. It was a beautiful car, and for a moment, genuine gratitude swelled in my chest. Then she handed me a small, elegant envelope. "The paperwork," she said lightly. I opened it. The title was solely in her name. "For insurance purposes, of course," she added smoothly. "But you are to treat it as your very own." With the title came another folder, this one thicker than the last. Just some standard documents our wealth manager insists on, she explained. Aligning our portfolios for tax efficiency. It's terribly dull, but necessary. I flipped through the pages. Phrases like irrevocable transfer, joint tenancy with rights of survivorship, and asset reassignment leaped out at me like warning flares. I gave her the same serene smile I had practiced in the mirror. Thank you, Beatrice. This is so generous. I'll add it to the pile for my lawyer to review. Her jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before her placid mask slipped back into place. That night, hiding in the guest bathroom with the water running, I heard her voice through the vent, low and sharp, on the phone with someone. No, not yet. She's more meticulous than I anticipated. But we'll get there. Patience is a virtue, especially when the prize is this large. The prize. Not me. Not her son's happiness. The prize. That was the moment my quiet observation turned into quiet action. The next morning, I told Julian I was meeting an old friend for coffee. Instead, I drove a rental car I'd booked under my maiden name to a nondescript co-working space on the industrial side of town. The office was small, private, and anonymous. It smelled of coffee and quiet ambition. I opened my encrypted laptop, logged into the Veridian Analytics dashboard, and watched the numbers on the screen. Profits were up. A new patent had just been approved. A major competitor was discreetly inquiring about a buyout. I took a deep, steadying breath. Then I opened a new file and began to type. Phase 1. Asset Fortification. I spent the next 4 hours on the phone with a legal team in Delaware I had vetted months ago, a firm that had no connection to Port Blossom or the Croft name. I instructed them to create a new holding company. I called it Riverbend Holdings, named after the quiet stretch of river where my grandfather had taught me to skip stones. The first transaction hit my phone a week later. I was at my co-working desk, finalizing a quarterly report for Veridian, when the notification popped up, a debit of $22,500 from the joint account Julian and I had opened for household expenses. The recipient was a company I'd never heard of, Croft Consolidated. My heart began to beat a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. I called Julian. He answered, his voice breezy. Hey you. What's up? What is Croft Consolidated? I asked, keeping my voice level. A pause. Oh, that. It's just a consulting fee for Mom's new venture. She's helping some of her friends with their estate planning. You moved over $20,000 without discussing it with me, Julian? From our joint account. He laughed, a sound that was meant to be reassuring but landed like a splash of cold water. Babe, it's our money. We're a team. You don't have to be so formal about everything. Don't you trust me? Trust. The word hung in the air between us. After I hung up, I spent an hour digging through public business registries. Croft Consolidated LLC had been formed 3 months before our wedding. The registered agents were Beatrice Croft and, to my surprise, Julian Croft. The business address was the family estate. Its stated purpose: strategic asset transition and management. Transition. Not consulting. Not planning. Transition. They weren't just testing the waters anymore. They were building the dam. That evening, at the mandatory Friday night family dinner, I waited until dessert was served. As Beatrice was pontificating about the charity gala she was chairing, I folded my napkin, placed it on the table, and said, I came across the most interesting new company today. Croft Consolidated. It sounds very impressive. The silence that fell over the dining room was absolute. Julian froze, a spoonful of mousse halfway to his mouth. Beatrice's smile became a thin, hard line. Just a little passion project of mine, she said, recovering quickly. Hardly worth mentioning. I think it's wonderful you're keeping so busy, I said, my tone full of gentle admiration. I had planted the seed. Now I would wait to see what grew. That night, I didn't go back to the room I shared with Julian. I told him I had a headache and would sleep in the guest suite. Once the house was dark and silent, I returned to my anonymous office. I logged into my accounts, took a deep breath, and initiated the transfer. $3.2 million, a fraction of Veridian's liquid assets, moved from its primary account into the impenetrable vault of Riverbend Holdings. As the confirmation blinked on the screen, I opened my journal and wrote a line from one of my grandfather's favorite poets. They thought I was a garden, but I am a wilderness. The wilderness was about to fight back. And the next battle would be for the one piece of ground I truly called my own. It happened on a Tuesday. I was working from my home office, the small, light-filled house I had bought with my own money years before the wedding, a sanctuary of warm woods and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The doorbell rang, a sharp, impatient chime. Through the peephole, I saw Beatrice, flanked by the same grim-faced notary from the sunroom. My stomach tightened, but my hands were steady as I opened the door. "Clara, darling." "So sorry to drop in unannounced," Beatrice chirped, sweeping past me into the foyer as if she owned the place. "We were just in the neighborhood and thought we could finalize that tiny bit of property paperwork. It will only take a moment." She held out a single sheet of paper. A deed transfer. It would add Julian and Beatrice's names to the title of my house as joint owners. "For tax purposes," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "It simplifies the marital estate. You'd be amazed at the deductions we can claim. Julian is fully on board." At that moment, Julian emerged from the hallway, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He told me he was working from the estate that day. He glanced at the paper in my hand, then at me, his expression a careful mixture of apology and encouragement. "Hey, Mom explained it to me. It's just a formality, Clara. It makes sense. It makes sense to sign my house over to you and your mother?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "You're making it sound so dramatic," Julian sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's our house now, isn't it? We're married. We're a family. Family." The word felt like a weapon in his mouth. I looked from his pleading face to Beatrice's expectant one. The notary stood by the door, pen at the ready. This was their pincer movement, designed to corner and overwhelm me. "We agreed to keep our premarital assets separate," I reminded him, my gaze locked on his. "Plans change, Clara," he said, his tone shifting from pleading to impatient. "Why do you have to be so difficult about this?" "Because you've shown me exactly who you are." I didn't say it aloud. I simply folded the deed in half, my movements calm and precise. "I'll need to think about it," I said. Beatrice's smile was a taut, brittle thing. "Of course, dear. But our accountant says these things are time-sensitive." After they left, the silence in my house felt different. It was no longer a comfort, but a battlefield. That afternoon, I drove downtown to a law firm I had found through my grandfather's old network. It was housed in a modest brick building, a world away from the gleaming towers where the Croft lawyers resided. My new attorney was a man named Arthur Sterling, a sharp, kind-eyed man in his late 60s who wore a worn but well-tailored tweed jacket. I placed the folded deed on his desk. "They want me to sign this." He read it, his expression unreadable. "This would give them full ownership rights. They could leverage it, sell it, or evict you from it, and you would have no legal recourse." "The house is in a trust my grandfather set up for me," I said. Arthur's eyebrows shot up. "The Viridian Trust? I'm familiar with it. Your grandfather was a very clever man." He leaned forward. "Does the trust have a breach clause?" I nodded. "No assets can be transferred or commingled without a review from the trust's board." Arthur smiled, a slow, satisfied spreading of his lips. "Then this document isn't just a request. It's an attempt to induce you to breach your own trust. And your grandfather, I suspect, planned for such a contingency." He was right. We spent the afternoon combing through the dense legalese of the prenuptial agreement Julian's lawyers had drafted, an agreement I had insisted my own team amend before signing. Tucked away in a subclause I'd barely understood at the time was what Arthur called the scorched earth protocol. It stated that any documented attempt by one party to manipulate the other into transferring protected trust assets would trigger an immediate and automatic reevaluation of the entire marital contract, effectively freezing the aggressor out of any and all claims. That night, Julian tried a different tactic. Over a dinner he'd cooked himself, a transparent attempt at a truce, he talked about the future. About legacy. About children. "I was thinking," he said, reaching for my hand across the table, Maybe it's time we put Viridian into a family trust. For our future kids. To protect it. Which family, Julian? I asked softly. He blinked. What do you mean? Your family or our family? He laughed nervously. Ours, of course. What's the difference? The difference was everything. Later that night, as he slept, I heard his phone buzz on the nightstand. I couldn't help but glance at the screen. A text from Beatrice. Any progress? The market is shifting. We need to move. He stirred, then rolled over, oblivious. I slipped out of bed, went to my office, and set up a small, discreet audio recorder. The next night, I got what I needed. I pretended to be asleep when he came to bed late. He thought I was dreaming when he picked up his phone and whispered into it. No, she hasn't signed the house over yet. She's being stubborn. But don't worry, Mom. I'll wear her down. She loves me. She'll crack eventually. The recording was crystal clear. The next morning, as I made him coffee, smiling as he kissed me goodbye, the audio file was already on its way to Arthur Sterling. The game had changed. They thought they were playing chess, but my grandfather had taught me to see the whole board, and I was finally ready to make my move. The final days of my marriage unfolded with the quiet, chilling precision of a well-rehearsed play. I was the perfect wife, attentive, affectionate, compliant. I listened to Julian's talk of stock options and weekend getaways. I complimented Beatrice on her gardening. I played my part so flawlessly that they relaxed, convinced my resistance had been a momentary flicker, now extinguished. They didn't see the storm gathering just behind my serene smile. The tell came on a Friday morning. I had installed a simple monitoring app on our shared network, a precaution Arthur had suggested. An alert pinged on my phone. Julian's device had just connected to the public Wi-Fi at the county courthouse. He had told me he had a breakfast meeting across town. I didn't panic. I didn't even feel a surge of adrenaline. I felt a profound, ice-cold calm. I walked into my office, sat at my desk, and opened the secure digital folder I had prepared with Arthur. It contained the signed and notarized petition to enact the Scorched Earth Protocol, complete with a time-stamped transcript of Julian's recorded phone call and copies of the deed transfer and asset consolidation agreements they had pressured me to sign. I attached the file to an email, addressed it to Arthur, and typed a single word in the subject line, now. Then I hit send. Arthur later told me how it played out. Julian, looking confident and smug, had strode up to the clerk's window to file an emergency petition to have our assets frozen, citing my erratic and uncooperative behavior as a danger to the marital estate. He was laying the groundwork to have me declared financially incompetent. But as the clerk typed his name into the system, her expression changed. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, not looking up. "There's already an active filing on this marital case. A protective order was put in place at 9:17 a.m. All shared assets are frozen, pending a hearing." Julian's face, Arthur said, was a study in disbelief. He stammered, demanding to see the filing. The clerk turned her monitor toward him. My name, Clara Thorne, was at the top of the document. He pulled out his phone, frantically dialing his mother, then me. I let it ring. While he was floundering in the courthouse lobby, I was sitting in a quiet, glass-walled boardroom downtown. Arthur Sterling was at my right, and the 3 trustees of my grandfather's estate, all loyal friends of his for over 40 years, were on my left. "The motion is filed," Arthur said, his voice even. "The prenuptial breach clause is officially triggered. He has no claim." One of the trustees, a kind-faced woman named Helen, pushed another, much older folio across the table. "Your grandfather left one last directive, Clara. To be opened only in the event of what he called a hostile emotional takeover." I opened it. Inside were documents I had never seen. Years ago, my grandfather had quietly set up 2 subsidiary companies under Viridian, parking a significant portion of the company's intellectual property and voting shares within them. The documents in the folio completed the final transfer of those shares to me. It wasn't just the 51% I thought I had. It was 81%. I wasn't just the CEO. I was the unassailable majority owner. "He always said to keep your best cards up your sleeve," Helen said gently. I exhaled, a breath I felt I had been holding for 2 years. Julian came home to a house that was no longer his. I was already gone. My personal belongings moved out by a discreet team while he was at the courthouse. All that was left for him on the polished marble of the foyer table was a single envelope. Inside was a photo from our wedding day. In it, we were smiling at the camera, but if you looked closely, you could see Beatrice in the background, a pen already uncapped in her hand, her eyes fixed on me not with a mother's love, but with an investor's calculation. On the back of the photo, I had written one sentence: "You were so focused on the prize, you never bothered to see who you married." A process server met him at the door 30 minutes later. The divorce was a formality. In the courtroom, Julian and Beatrice sat with a team of expensive lawyers who looked increasingly bewildered as the judge dismantled their case piece by piece. Their petitions were dismissed, their claims denied. The prenup was ironclad. My trust was untouchable. "It appears, Mr. Croft," the judge said, peering over his spectacles, "that you profoundly underestimated your wife." Julian's only response was a low, bitter question directed at his lawyer, but loud enough for me to hear. Was any of it real? I left the courthouse and didn't look back. I didn't feel triumph, only a deep, anchoring quiet. The fight was over. The silence I had cultivated had not been a shield, but a crucible. It had burned away everything that wasn't real, leaving only the truth of who I was. In the weeks that followed, I didn't retreat. I expanded. Viridian launched a new charitable wing, funding ecological preservation projects up and down the coast. But my real project was smaller, more personal. My grandfather had, years ago, bought a derelict boat-building workshop on the industrial waterfront. It was a wreck with broken windows and a listing roof, but the bones were good. Instead of selling it, I began to restore it. I didn't hire a fancy firm. I put out a call for local artisans, retired craftspeople, and young people looking to learn a trade. We weren't just rebuilding the workshop, we were building a community hub, a place for free classes in woodworking, engine repair, and navigation. A place where knowledge was the only currency. One crisp autumn afternoon, as I was sweeping sawdust from the newly laid floor, Julian appeared in the doorway. He looked thinner, his expensive suit rumpled. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out weariness. "I heard what you were doing here," he said, his voice flat. I nodded, leaning on my broom. He gestured around the bustling workshop, at the teenagers learning to varnish a canoe, at the old fisherman showing a young woman how to splice a rope. "Was it worth it?" he asked, his eyes searching mine for something: absolution, maybe, or anger. I thought for a moment, the scent of cedar and sea salt filling the air. I thought of the lies, the betrayals, the cold calculations. And I thought of the quiet strength I had found in their wake. "The clarity?" I said. "Yes. It was worth everything." He held my gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small, defeated nod and walked away. I watched him go until he was just a silhouette against the gray water, and I felt nothing but a quiet, clean peace. That evening, I drove to the cemetery as the sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the headstones. I knelt by my grandfather's grave and placed a small, polished piece of redwood on the grass. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He knew. He had always known. What I had inherited wasn't a company or a fortune. It was the wisdom to know the difference between what people want from you and who you truly are. It was the courage to build something that reflected not their expectations, but my own soul. Have you ever had to stand silently in your own truth, waiting for the right moment to speak? Let me know your story in the comments. I read every one.